Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
If you notice this week, if you're watching us on YouTube, maybe you can even hear it qualitatively in the sound.
Ooh.
I don't know. But we're in a different studio. We're in our newer studio now. We've been away from a studio for multiple months. So we've been shooting outdoors. We've had guests on the show. We've featured what we couldn't fix. And we've gone and done live podcasts in Atlanta, Georgia, here in Gettysburg. Got some more of those planned. But today we are back in the studio. It's just you and me, Antonia, once again, without our guests and without our live environment. So I think this is a perfect opportunity for us to dive into some deeper content this week. And not just this week. I think we should do a 4-part series because we've talked about it before we started rolling on the show.
We did.
We have the plan. And
We already
we're
know.
going to introduce it to you in just a moment. By the way, we are starting something very new here at Personality Hacker. Now, you might be listening to this years from now, and so it's something that's gone on for a while. But as of the time of this recording, it's fairly new. We're starting up an experience of our podcast live once a week online in a virtual format. So what we're doing is we're gathering a group of like minds to come together once a week to watch this podcast together. And then right afterward, we have a membership program where people can come. It's called a personality quest. And we talk about the podcast right afterward. We unpack the learning from it, how we can apply it to our lives. And then we give the entire group of people that have gathered an assignment or a challenge for that week, some journal prompts and some reflection, but also a challenge that week to go test out in their real life, to go explore in the world. All of us are going to do the same challenge that week. And we come back the following week, we talk about it, unpack it, and we get the learning from it. And every week getting together to do this, we've already been doing a few weeks. It's been fantastic. I've loved doing it. It's awesome to see people come and gather live to watch the podcast, talk about it, and go do challenges in their own lives. You should be a part of this. If you're listening or you're watching, we want you to be part of it. Currently, we're doing it on Sundays. You can find out more information to be part of Personality Quest if you come over to personalityhacker.com/quest, and you can learn all about the quests and what we're doing there and get yourself involved, because I think you're going to love this experience, especially if you've loved the podcast and you love personality types and personal growth and the intersection of those two things. It's one of the things that I am super excited about going forward with. So, and there's going to be some live elements to that. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that we've got planned around this. But right now we're just starting with these weekly gatherings, and I'd love for you to be involved. Okay, now let's get into what we're talking about today, Antonia.
Okay.
So there's this phenomenon that I have that I'll be talking with, like we'll be with people that are familiar with type. They may not be in our profile or training program or anything like that, but they're familiar with type. We're talking to somebody, or we're watching somebody online, and they're basically saying, like, the person might reflect and say, I'm this type. Let's just say ENTJ. And the person might see that on a video, or they're talking to them like, you can't be an ENTJ. You don't have that domineering, commanding presence to tell people what to do. You're not the field marshal archetype of person, right? You don't command people. You don't just order people around. You're not all about the money. You're not, and I'm thinking to myself, that's not an what? That's not an ENTJ. Like, that can be an ENTJ, but there's a bunch of other variances of ENTJs in the world besides that. This person is putting it down to very black and white, one note of a personality type. And you and I know, Antonia, there's so much variance for every personality. And there's reasons for this. There's source code for this. There's reasons why different personalities show up differently. Obviously, it's station of life, timeline, training, upbringing, the age the person is, all these factors. But there's also something in the actual wiring of the mind, the cognitive wiring of the mind, that's a little different based on how people express their type. We talked about this a little bit on the podcast before when we applied it to careers, but I want to jump in this today, and let's do this series of these episodes. Let's talk about each of the Jungian cognitive functions in some of the ways they can express to give some more nuance to how types show up.
Yeah. I'm glad you referenced the careers podcast, because if you've listened or watched the 16 different basically the subtype series. We call them subtypes. Yeah. And it's based off of the work of our friend and colleague, Dr. Dario Nardi. There's a lot of information there about those subtypes. And the entire time we're talking about an analytic or a holistic version of the first two functions. So if you're new to type, by the way, we will be going a bit deeper in these 4 episodes. And we highly recommend that you head over to personalityhacker.com and look up the CAR model or cognitive functions so that you can get some familiarity with the building blocks of type. So the building blocks of personality isn't just the 4-letter code. It sources back originally to Carl Jung's book, Psychological Types, which outlines 8 different cognitive functions in chapter 10 that all of us are using all the time, but we favor a certain, like a couple of them as our favorite way of interacting and engaging with the world. But we're all using all 8 of them all the time. So that's really, and from our point of view, that's the power of the system. So if you're brand new to type and you're just learning about Myers-Briggs or what some people are calling 16 personalities, then we recommend that you do just a little bit of research around those cognitive functions. And we'll try to make them very accessible in this 4-part series. But that said, yeah, there is a lot of variance in those functions. And it's important to understand that we have a tendency, we all have biases, and we're usually unaware of them. And one of the biases that we have is our first 4 functions, for those of you learning the CAR model, or for those of you who are more technical, what Dr. John Beebe calls our egosyntonic functions, the first 4. Those we have a complex, multi-layered relationship to. The 4 that we aren't using egosyntonically, what he would call egodystonically, or for those of you just learning the 4 functions that are not in our CAR, it's very easy for us to oversimplify them, to see them as just something to understand in other people, to not really understand, not own them for ourselves, not recognize the influence that they have on us.
Yeah.
And John's model and Dr. John Beebe's model, he calls them the shadow functions. And we've done entire podcasts on that concept. So please feel free to go look that up. But all of the functions have, it's like a territory they occupy. It's an energy that they come with. And there is usually a lot more complexity involved in them than we will sometimes give them credit for, because we'll get just a little bit of an understanding of a function, especially one that isn't one of quote unquote ours, right? Egosyntonic CAR model. We'll get a little impression of it, and then we believe we understand it. And that will be that'll be our definition when we're typing other people. It'll be our definition when we think we're using it or when we're not. I've seen people, you talked about somebody with ENTJ preferences. I've seen people talk about extroverted sensing as the jumping out of a plane function, right?
Yeah.
And so,
which it can be,
right? But that's not what it's limited to.
Yeah.
So the concept we're going to go into is it's the layer underneath the subtypes. And it's also really important information, in my opinion, for us to understand. And I think it's some of the freshest work to come out of type in a long time.
Yeah.
Now, again, it's come from our friend Dario, and he has a book coming out at the time of this recording. It will be coming out by the time we end the series. It will have already been out.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting time-bound experience right now.
Go either pre-order or order your copy, depending on the timeline that you're in.
That's right.
Asynchronously from this podcast.
Exactly. And the book is going to be called, if you want to pre-order it, Decode Your Personality, 64 Brain-Based Subtypes to Go Beyond Myers-Briggs. And a part of this also brings in the work of like Dr. Victor Galenko, who is an influential voice in socionics. And then Dr. Helen Fisher's work and neurotransmitters and hormones. So there's a little bit of merging of, adjacent systems and other systems.
Well, and Dario's own work with EEG brain imaging.
Exactly.
Because that's really where, the brain imaging, he can see subtypes showing up in your brain on the scans.
Exactly.
Basically determining that.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and I have heard other systems talk a little bit about an adjacent concept to this. Each of the functions, we're going to go into the flavors that they can take on. And I've heard some people call something similar like masculine and feminine energies. But I think that the way that Dario, exactly. I think the way that Dario has it set up, I think makes it very easy it's very accessible and it's very understandable, and it avoids some of the pitfalls of, talking about masculine and feminine energies and that sort of thing. And I think that it's a whole, it just really opens up a whole new appreciation for each of the 8 functions. So without further ado, I just wanted to do a little bit of a little bit of preamble to indicate that I feel like this, whether you're brand new or have been into type for a super long time, I think there's something here that's really beneficial for everybody.
Yeah. And if we back up one level, so we're, if you remember, so if you're into personality type and you understand cognitive functions, let's just start here in a framework of, we're talking about 4 key elements that are in all of us. We have a sensing part, which is connected to the sensory world, our senses. We have a feeling part of us, right? Connected to our feelings and emotions and others' feelings and emotions.
And our values.
Our values. We have a thinking part of us, thoughts and information and resource and things that we're thinking about.
Problem solving.
And then we have an intuitive part of us. And, this is our abstractions, our imaginations, our predictions and patterns. Mm-hmm. So what the Myers-Briggs system does is what the functions do is they split sensing with two different attitudes. So it takes sensing, the sensory world, and it splits it. It has an extroverted attitude of sensing and then an introverted attitude of sensing. So now that we get 8 cognitive functions, can you split sensing into 2, extroverted, introverted, thinking, extrovert, introvert, feeling, extrovert, introvert, intuition, extrovert, introvert. And so now we've got 8 functions and where they're pointed. We're talking about going a layer even deeper than that. So we're going to take, for example, extroverted sensing, which is the extroverted attitude of the sensing process, and we're going to give it a flavor now of either analytic or holistic. So we're talking about taking that function itself and splitting it down to 2 different variants as well. Mm-hmm. So that's where we're at. Like if you're following along in the, the pyramid tree of breaking these apart more and more, that's the place where we're at navigationally.
Exactly. And so you just introduced it, which is fantastic, which is that we're going to talk about the flavoring of each of the 8 functions and whether or not they have an analytic or a holistic preference. So what I find really interesting about this is that analytic or holistic preference, it actually lives, in some ways, it can live outside of the functions. It's kind of a preference of the individual, honestly.
Yeah.
It makes me think of when I first understood subtypes in the Enneagram. So in Enneagram, you have 9 different types, and then you have what are called instincts. And those are sexual, self-preservation, and social.
Yeah.
And they have qualities and characteristics distinctive to the instincts themselves. And then when you grab one of those instincts and marry it with one of the 9 types, now you have a subtype. And there's almost like an alchemical reaction that happens between those 2 things, those 2 concepts.
Yeah.
And I think there's a similar thing going on here. There's a certain energy or traits that come along with an analytic bent or preference. And there are certain traits that come along with a holistic bent or preference. And that lives over here. And then you take the 8 functions. And when you marry this energy, this analytic or holistic preference, let's just say analytic, to one of the functions, let's say extroverted intuition, there's almost like an alchemical response that happens and certain qualities and characteristics come from it, right? It's like this times this equals this. And the same thing with like a holistic marriage to extroverted intuition are going to come up with different characteristics or traits, but they're going to be similar enough, just like the subtypes in Enneagram are very similar to each other as well. So think of it as like almost like a math equation. This times this equals this. And we've done podcast episodes on Enneagram subtypes too, if you want to go check those out. So I think what would be good is to first talk about what are the characteristics and traits that come along with an analytic preference and traits that come along with a holistic preference. And then over the course of the 4 episodes, we'll marry them to the different functions and see how that sort of alters the flavoring of the function. So analytic is a more assertive energy. It's more of I almost think of it as like a push out. Now, this is different than extroversion. Extroversion is just being like aware and engaged with the outside world, right? It's like, oh, this is very interesting. All these things that are not inside of me, right? All of these things that are surrounding me in the outside world.
Yeah.
Introversion is the opposite. It's like, oh, everything inside of the confines of my skin is like super interesting, right? Yeah. And it's like the thing that captures your attention. Is it inner world or outer world focused? This is a slightly different concept. This is more about whether or not something is asserting itself or it's a more receptive energy. The analytic is a more assertive energy. So even if it's introverted, let's take, for example, just to illustrate the point, introverted feeling or authenticity. We think of it as like understanding what you like, your preferences, your values, a little bit of your conscience, like the things that make you feel certain ways. And when you end up, thinking that something's super important, you can either keep it inside or you can start telling everybody that this thing is super important, right? So even though it was sourced in an introverted place, you can still be assertive about the conclusions you came to inside of yourself. So this is more about what you're going to do with the conclusions. What are you going to do with what's coming up for you? So it's not introversion and extroversion. It's assertion, right? I'm going to now push it out to assert this in the world, or I'm going to have a more receptive, receiving quality. And this can get kind of confusing when you're talking about an extroverted function that is receptive, right? Or an introverted function that is assertive. It gets kind of shady there. It gets kind of confusing.
I think there's the word intentionality, or I guess initiative is another word that could be used, like initiative energy versus kind of waiting and receptive energy for it to come this direction.
Right, like
the
passive.
Passive, maybe initiative. So initiative is another word that might help if you're having trouble latching onto this, like you're getting it confused with extroverted, introvert. I think that can be a language that can help there.
And I also think of it in terms of things like there's a form of meditation that has you focusing like on single points on maybe like an imperfection in the wall. And so you're hyper focused on a single point. And that's what's taking all of your time, all of your focus and attention. That would be more of sort of an assertive energy.
You have
right?
blinders on almost.
That's right. Yeah, you're like really hyper focused. And then there's a form of meditation called Shambhala. I think we did a podcast on it a million years ago. But we interviewed somebody who does Shambhala meditation. And it's the exact opposite. As opposed to being hyper focused on a single point, you actually intentionally lid your eyes. And you try to take in as much peripheral as you possibly can. And so you're taking in a much, much, much bigger picture, but you can't see anything very clearly. And so I think of the analytic energy as being that hyper focused on a single point. That's why it's kind of almost like assertive, right? It's like it's asserting attention to a single point.
Yeah. Versus
a holistic energy would be more like the Shambhala, which is you're receiving more information. It's a broader perspective, a broader view, but you're not seeing anything with very much specificity.
Yeah.
So that might be a little easier for understanding than assertive, receptive.
I'm going to suggest that we're going to go through a list here, compare and contrast. I think that's going to land it.
I think so too.
For you listening or watching right now. So, I mean, let's just look at, so the analytic style or energy is going to be more goal focused, seeking a desired outcome, and it's going to be filtering out distractions. So this is like goals, it's focal point, like you said. The holistic energy is going to be more open-ended. It's seeking input and reflecting on data without filters while attending patiently with curiosity to the flow of the process. So this is like already we're seeing more goal-focused versus kind of just letting things kind of happen and then seeing what emerges and flows into the frame. Right,
exactly. So the analytic is like, it tends to look like it has more clarity. It tends to look like it has more confidence. It's more goal focused. And so it looks like it's a person on a mission a little bit more, like the energy itself. Yeah. Like you said, as opposed to the more open, curious, sort of emergent energy. Yeah. It also, the analytic has a top-down approach, whereas the holistic tends to have a bottom-up approach. And you're more aware, like you understand that top-down concept and bottom-up concept a little bit better than I do. I have a tendency to struggle with the idea, probably because I'm a bottom-up. So what do you think of when you think of something being top-down?
Well, I think of it kind of having I think it's more of having a ready-made solution or an idea of how it needs to be, that you're looking for application of it. Like you're not looking to build the solution as you go through and find the problems and solve them. It's almost like you have the solution and you're looking for problems to apply it to.
Right. Yes.
Like I've got the hammer. Where's the nail?
Right.
Show me the nail. I've got the hammer. I think that's more of a top-down approach.
Yep.
Whereas I think bottom-up is, it's like, well, what are we working with? We're working with nails, screws. I'll get the tool that's appropriate for the thing that I'm dealing with here.
More of a discovery process.
Yeah. And so I think that's the difference in my mind, top-down.
Fantastic. Thank you for explaining that, because I'm always like, what does it mean top down? So analytic is more top down.
Yeah.
Right. You have the solution. You have the hammer. You're looking for the nail. And the holistic is more of a, like you said, what are we working with? Are we working with hammers and nails and screws or whatever? So it tends to be a little bit more open. The analytic style has a tendency to consider things in a more complex way. Right? It almost is like thinker energy, almost like. This is why it makes it so complicated. But it brings in what's most relevant. It brings in viewpoints that will be helpful, and it excludes all the ones that will not be.
I love how you interpret thinking as complex and like as if emotions and motivations and all those things are, oh, those are really simple. There's no complexity there. So it's almost like thinking, complex like thinking.
Okay, you got me. Fair enough. My bias is showing. You're right. My apologies. Actually, to be fair, feeling is like the most complex thing that I can think of.
Certainly. I just thought it was funny that you...
I meant in terms of problem solving.
Sure.
Right.
I get your intent, but I just thought it was funny how even in the midst, even knowing as much as we know, our biases still come through in this.
You called it. All right. Okay, yes. They consider situations in a complex way, like all of the functions can be, including feeling. And not just thinking. That's the analytic style. The holistic style tends to be more of a, it's like it's not looking for it's not looking for just the solutions and removing all of the irrelevant elements. It's bringing all the stuff in. Again, it's like that Shambhala, and it's bringing all the things in and kind of like taking them as they come, and that includes things that might seem irrelevant to other people, but to a holistic mind, it's like, well, maybe that's relevant. So again, it's bringing in that periphery. The analytic style tends to focus on known problems, and the holistic style tends to try to find novel solutions.
Yeah.
Right? Analytic also tends to be a little bit more visual, and holistic tends to be more auditory.
Yeah.
So what they're paying attention to with like visual, it's like more like people's body language, visual cues, finding visual solutions, right?
Well, I think visual information is immediate, and it's like holistic. Weirdly enough, it's analytic, but it's like you get a ton of information like right now, a snapshot. As a picture's worth 1,000 words. Right. Whereas sound, audio, words, it's like the story unfolding over a timeline. You've got to wait for the word to. Every word has to come after the next word, and you're waiting. You're being patient to absorb it in real time through a timeline. Yep. Whereas like a snapshot can happen in a moment.
Yes.
And so I think that's the difference too, is probably the speed at which the information wants to be processed.
Yep.
So by the way, as we're going through this, just be tuning into yourself. Like, we're not even talking about specific function or type right now. Which one of these do you already lean toward? As you're like reflecting, are you more holistic in nature? Like, would you call yourself more of a holistic person, more receptive, more diffused, more open? Or are you more analytic? You're more assertive, more focused, more deliberate, faster. So just kind of get a sense of where you're showing up too.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I'd add to the auditory, I think you're totally dead right about that. The visual is faster. I think auditory, unlike the visual that is more focused on body language and that sort of thing, auditory is more focused on tonality and tends to think in a more narrative way.
Yeah.
Right. There is a lot more attention in the analytic to content, facts, rules, methods, numbers, deduction. That is more thinker.
Yeah. There you go.
Regardless of the function it's associated with.
It's fine.
Whereas the holistic style tends to be more about tones and intentions and ethics, artistry, emotional impact, expressiveness, humor and metaphor. So in this way, an analytic energy will almost mimic a thinker energy, and a holistic energy will mimic a feeler energy.
So this proves, not proves, that's the wrong word. This is illustrating, there you go. It's illustrating what we talked about earlier of like, that can't be an ENTJ. How many times have you been accused, Antonia, of being like an ESFJ when somebody's watching our YouTube videos? Yeah. Or I've never seen any, like ENTP coming from her. That can't be her.
That can't be.
She's got to be a feeler. But I would say you're more holistic, like overall, not just your functions, but you have more of a holistic style. And for me, I have a much more analytic style, even though I'm a feeler, which I have a lot of feeling, don't get me wrong, but I tend to be analytic and driven and focused and on it and high speeds and all this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think people get like I've been called an INFJ, like few preferences, but INFJ, it's weirdly enough, I don't know, maybe it's because of the way I'm bringing out thinking, or I don't know what it is.
I don't know. Yeah.
ENFJ, these kinds of like more assertive, dominant kind of styles of like, judger style energy in the world, whatever.
Yeah. You know who never questions whether or not we're both ENPs? The people who work with us.
Oh yeah.
None of our staff
they
believes
lament it.
Oh yeah.
They don't question it. They just like, They've written books and about the trauma of it.
Yeah, I'm sure volumes have been written. And I think, well, the cat's out of the bag. I'm a more holistic type, right? I favor the holistic energy.
Oh, you were waiting. You were holding that back?
No, I wasn't.
As a surprise?
No, I wasn't. But you said it. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to roll. I don't know if that's entirely natural to me. I just know that it was trained into me.
Yeah.
And I think it's the result of being born into and raised in a very fundamentalist cultish religion. That was like basically anytime I asserted anything, I got my hand slapped.
Yeah.
So it was a survival strategy to become real chill, real holistic, real lean back. Right? It's like, okay, whatever. Like, I'm just going to be curious. I'm just going to open myself up and just see what happens next. And actually getting into analytic energy, which is something that I'm trying to train myself to do more and more. It's a real struggle for me. It's very difficult for me to get into that energy because I've been so trained out of it. Yeah. So I think a part of this is training. Like whether or not we favor an analytic or holistic bent, I think is part of the nurture component of type. I do think there was a more natural assertive energy in me when I was younger, and it just got beaten out of me basically. And I don't think that's uncommon. I think that's one of the challenges that women talk about a lot is that I don't know if they know they're saying this, but the language I hear is we're all trained to be holistic, and men get to be analytic. And
men are, I think, trained to be analytic.
Yeah.
If you're not, that you get a lot of pressure to be so.
You got it. Yep.
Same way as women getting trained out of it.
Yeah. And I think this is part of the like sort of the gender stereotypes and that sort of thing. And I think men sometimes lament that they can't be holistic, and women lament, or you have a more holistic man who, is there a place for me? Or a more analytic woman, is there a place for me? Right. And so if we're not the thing that is the expectation, the people who are the expectation are lamenting that they're not the opposite. And the people who are the opposite are lamenting that they're not the expectation, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we all have problems. But that said, not to get off on too many rabbit trails when we're still in the middle of the list, but let's go back to the analytic versus
you know me,
holistic.
I'm a feeler. I'm trying to apply it to the personal, like how we show up, not just a list of data. But let's go back to the list of data because I'm also interested in this.
Yep.
Let's go.
So analytic styles are more literal thinkers. So they tend to be more literal, even if they're intuitive preferenced, right? Yeah. And so there's going to be a limit to their thinking and their ideas to the current context specified. So they're not going to bring a bunch of stuff in, right? They're literal. So they're like, okay, here's the thing that I'm talking about. Here's the challenge that I'm working on. And again, other stuff will be shut out. Versus holistic is a more figurative style of thinking.
Yeah.
And that means that there's going to be, they're going to be more likely to limit the scenario, not to the context, but more to their identity, more to values, and be more metaphorical in the way that they're looking at things. Analytic styles are more comfortable working in hierarchies.
Yeah.
Holistic has a tendency to prefer a more egalitarian way.
More flat organization. Mm-hmm. We're all in this together kind of energy.
Yep, you got it. Analytic styles are more, they tend to be blind to their biases, including the fact that they're analytic, right? So one of the disadvantages to the analytic style is that they're less aware of their biases. And I think the holistic style is a little bit more aware of biases.
Yeah.
Right. But they might not be, Dario says they might not be sufficiently empowered or confident to make a choice or a change. Right. So they're more aware that they are holistic, that they tend to be receptive, and that they might need more analytic energy. But it's harder for them to do it. Yeah. I experience that all the time. Whereas the analytic is more unaware of the bias, but and that gives them a confidence. That's part of the confidence that comes from this. But I suspect that once they realize it, I have a feeling that it might be a little easier to to enter the holistic energy.
Yeah. And I think that's important. I want to lay that down right now as we're going. I know we'll unpack this later. Is these are not static like personality types. Mm-hmm. You have one of these energies that this is trainable. This is more nurture than nature. And I think you can train yourself to lean into the other energy. If you're more holistic, you can train yourself. And we have the tools of the functions themselves, which we'll talk about in a moment. And through the whole series, there's actual ways to do that. Like there's exercises In fact, I think soon Dario is going to bring some content out where he's going to talk about breath work that can change our state and move us into the energies. So there's all sorts of things we can do to flex and flow with this.
Yep, you got it. So we're going to start with the sensing functions, and I think we should follow it with the intuitive functions and then do the judging functions last.
Oh,
does that work?
Okay, sure.
Then we can just start with perceiving and then move on to judging.
Yeah.
So with the perceiving functions, if they have an analytic style, whether it's intuition or sensing, it doesn't matter. If you're a more analytic intuition or a more analytic sensing function of all four of them, then there's a tendency to be more focused on a central figure rather than everything going on around it. So he likens it to if you're watching a play, being really focused on the main character or whoever's talking on the stage. Whereas if it's a more holistic version, it's more like being focused on everything, including like what's going on off stage around you, right?
Reddit. I think of Reddit. Like you'll show me a meme on Reddit and there's this thing on this GIF that's happening, like the main event, like somebody's riding a bike and they're doing some activity. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And then I'll look at the comments of the thing you showed me and people were mentioning like some obscure detail of like a coffee cup in the background. And some poster on the wall or like all these obscure, like, I'm like, how do they even notice that?
Yeah.
Like, what is going on there? Like, I'm focused on the activity at hand, not all the stuff behind the activity.
Yep.
But other people seem to be more fascinated by that than the main thing on the screen.
Yep.
I've always been baffled by that, but I think I think that'd be a good example of attunement to more of the entire picture versus what is the action that's happening right in front of me?
Yeah. But like if we have 2 books on our library, people would be like, why do you have 2 copies of that book? And we're like, we do. But that would be a more holistic experience of watching the podcast. The video is like you're not just watching the person, you're watching all the things around them. That's a more holistic frame. And analytic would just be focused straight on whoever's talking.
I'm judgmental to those people. I'm like, get focused on the thing we need to be doing. Like, you're getting distracted with all these extra details. It's not specifically picking apart books on the podcast, but anyway, it's like watching a GIF and mentioning all the nuance of it. I'm like, what does that matter? Why do you care about that? That doesn't serve your life at all. And I get really judgy. And then I'm like, why am I being judgy about neutral things?
Those dang holistic people. Can't live with them. Can't shoot them. What do we do with them? Yeah, no, fair. And I mean, I think that it goes the other direction too.
I'm sure it does.
I think holistic people can be quite judgy of the analytic people.
I drive them crazy.
That's right. So, I mean, we could do like a whole podcast just on that as a personality type.
Sure.
Analytic versus holistic. But wait, there's more. So now we get to some of the meat of this beyond just this distinction. So again, think of this as having its own traits. We just read off the compare and contrast of all of the traits of an analytic versus a holistic preference.
Yeah.
And you've already mentioned you have a preference for analytic, and I mentioned I have a preference for holistic.
I think I have a compulsion for it, not just a preference for it. I think I'm like obsessed about being it this way. Like this is very much driving me on so many levels as we're reading through this. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's just like, oh yeah, it's sort of my preference. Like I see it very strong. Now, I will say there's part of me that identifies a lot of the holistic stuff too.
Sure.
And depending on which part of me we're talking about, it feels more balanced.
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk maybe more about that in a little bit. But
yes,
let's jump into the sensing functions if you're ready for that.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and that actually is a good segue to a piece of information that's important to mention before we get nothing but comments of, can I be both? Yes, you can. In fact, in the subtype podcasts, we mentioned it is whether or not your first 2 functions. So take, for example, me having ENTP preferences. I have extroverted intuition or exploration as my first driver function. And I have introverted thinking or accuracy as my auxiliary or co-pilot function. And if you prefer both of them to be analytic, that creates a dominant subtype. If you prefer both of them to be holistic, that creates a harmonizing subtype. And then depending upon the function and the configuration, there's also a creative or a normalizing subtype. We go way into it in all of those podcasts, so please go check it out. But that indicates...
There's a podcast specifically for your personality type. So go look up the specific one for your type. I think you're going to resonate deeply with it.
You got it. And so there are many people who are both, right? The other thing that I think is important to mention, and this is that segue, is when the higher up a function is for you, so the closer it is to your first function, so let's say the first function, right, the driver function, you're very likely to be able to play both sides. right? You have access to the analytic and the holistic version. And Dario even mentions, and I have seen this play out in coaching, if you can't go between them, that creates a form of one-sidedness, and that's worrying. So one of the challenges I have is, and we'll talk about it in in a future podcast, the next one, my extroverted intuition is very holistic, and I really struggle to get into the analytic version of it. And I know that creates one-sidedness in me. I know it's a challenge. So that's the other thing, is that if you're going like, can I be both? The answer is yes, you should be both, right? Particularly for your first function.
That's the goal.
And if possible, your second one too.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's a goal. So yes, you can before you ask.
Yeah.
Okay, now we can get into the sensing functions.
Which gives us tons of opportunity for personal growth using just our personality type alone.
Yes.
Because there's so much to grow our functions themselves, but also grow different expressions of those functions inside of our personality. It's a lifetime of work. We'd never run out of things to do to work on ourselves in that.
You got it. Okay, so let's start with extroverted sensing.
We've called this here at Personality Hacker sensation. It's really about the sensory world in a rich way.
Yep.
Particularly the sensory world in this moment. Like all the physical senses I can see, touch, taste, smell, hear, my physical body, the impressions, also the feelings inside my body of hunger, being tuned into all of the sensory things that are happening right now. Not in the past sensory experience, but right now, the sensory moment. And it's single perspective minded. It's not really taking into other perspectives. It's focused on the here and now with a single viewpoint in all of this.
Yep.
So let's talk about that function we call sensation. How does it show up, analytic or holistic based on that understanding of the function?
Yeah, I would add 2 words of presence and experience.
Yes.
Right. So it's a function that is very present in the moment, very tuned into the environment, it's extroverted. So it's very aware of what's going on around it. And it has a hunger for experience, right? Wanting to have experiences. Now, the word experience is vague and abstract, and there's a gajillion different kinds of experiences. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the oversimplification of this function, which is rife amongst type communities, I think that's it's important to remember that experiences are varied and vast. And as varied and vast as experiences are, so is this function.
Yeah.
So the 2 different kinds, we're going to pare it down. We're going to marry extroverted sensing or sensation with an analytic energy and a holistic energy, and look at how it's a slightly different function depending upon which orientation it's associated with. So extroverted sensing or sensation, when it has an analytic bent, this is the stereotype of Dario calls it the mover, right? It's a person who is asserting their energy and their experience into the outside world. It's more of the adrenaline version. It's the one that wants to go bungee jumping or go do fun, interesting things and get its heart rate up. It's the part of you that wants to not just have an experience, but have an experience.
A maximum experience.
You got it. It's a feeling of a maximum aliveness. And it loves the feeling of pushing the limits. I see this in our daughter. In early podcasts, we said that I thought she might have ENFP preferences, but that's just because she was doing that monkey see, monkey do thing. I'm pretty sure at this point she has ESFP preferences. It'd be very difficult for me to unsee that. And it's really fascinating to observe how often she just goes towards an aggressive physical activity. Like performance.
Broadcasting her voice loudly, articulating wild, really bombastic energy.
That's right. And lots of cartwheels and round-offs, right? Lots of climbing trees, lots of doing things that are probably like she's already been on the roof of our new house multiple times, to a point where I see handprints on the outside of the windows in the second story that I can't get to. She has, right? She's up there. And so it's like, I didn't even know she was there. I just see the evidence of the handprint at this point, right? And she's 11.
Yeah.
So this is the appetite for life. It's the joie de vivre. It's the desire to play in a big way. And so this is the version of extroverted sensing that I think a lot of people are more tapped into. But it can also be, like promoting a new show or landing a deal or anything that gets your heart racing. It helped me understand why my dad, who had ESTP preferences, loved marketing and sales. He loved walking in, making a deal, getting as good a deal as humanly possible, and then walking out of the room like acting like it was no big deal. But he loved it. It just got his blood going, you know?
First responders, special ops in the military, people that really want to apply this sensation function in a deliberate, intentional way, often are this analytic version.
Yeah. And Dario talks about it. I mean, like he gives a story of like a friend who has this function, who they were going to cross a street and there was a policeman who was directing traffic up to a median. And the ISFP friend just like jaywalked up to the policeman at the median and looked at him and was like, "Hey, how you doing?" And then continued jaywalking. It was like, it's kind of this like throw caution at the wind, go take direct action, right? See what you can get away with and have this sort of joie de vivre about it the entire time.
Yeah.
So that's the more analytic version. The holistic version is the one that, and I see this function being described more as the analytic version than the holistic version, even in Myers-Briggs circles. But I do know that Myers-Briggs, at the point of origin, described extroverted sensing a little bit more as the holistic version. And the holistic version, again, remember, it's like a more receptive energy. It's taking in more context. It's less assertive. So this is more about pleasure, right? This is more about the sensory experiences of life. It's less about jumping out of a plane or landing the deal or, walking up to a policeman and jaywalking and being like, "Hey, how you doing?" and keeping going. Like it's less of that attitude. And it's more like the experience of putting your feet in the sand or going to a club and listening to thumping music and being a part of that, right? It's more about just being in the vibe of life.
Dario draws a contrast with that idea of pleasure against comfort. So he draws a contrast between pleasure and comfort. And he says it's actually not about comfort. It is truly about pleasure. And that's a distinction he makes. And I think that's an important distinction to make here because it's easy to think in terms of, that more receptive, holistic pleasure. I immediately think, comfort, warm blankets, sitting by the fire with a cup of coffee,
right?
That kind of thing. But that's not, that can be pleasurable, but there is still like a sensation or I guess an immediate moment of pleasure that's happening in the here and now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, pleasure is more stimulating, right? Yeah. Comfort is less stimulating. It's more kind of like, it's more passive. Pleasure is more heading towards something, even if it's a slow amble towards it. And he gave an example in his new book about like somebody who might just want to go experience all the pleasure of, like, say, slowly traveling through Thailand for a while and experiencing the jungle and the beaches and the clubs. And it's about absorbing all of the experiences, surfing, watching the sunset, dropping in on a party, dancing, drumming, maybe smoking some ganja, right? It's like the whole thing, right? Just experiencing all of it.
Yeah.
And there's a fun, relaxed feeling towards it.
Yeah.
So the people who have this function that tend more towards like all the sensory experiences of food, the foodies, or the ones who just like kicking with friends and drinking a beer on the beach and watching the sunset as they're talking to their friends. Like, I don't think people realize that extroverted sensing and the holistic version can love long, fun, interesting conversations just as much as anybody else can. Because we get this idea that SP types want to be more action oriented. They don't like to sit around and talk. They want to go do. But the holistic version of this, the sensate version, loves an experience like that. So it's more of the absorbing the pleasures of life as opposed to getting the big max aliveness moments out of life.
Yeah, I would also think that maybe this person that's more holistic in nature would be more likely to watch extreme sports, let's say, than go do the extreme. They're still interested in the extroverted sensing or sensation, like, the person that's jumping off the cliff with like the parachute and going down, but they prefer to watch like a simulation of it or watch it than do it themselves necessarily. They're still interested in that kind of activity, the max aliveness activity, but they want to do it more in a receptive or passive way.
Like vicarious.
Yeah, vicariously.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean they wouldn't ever do something like that. It just means that's more natural to them to watch it happen than do it themselves potentially.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And the holistic sensate version is going to be more likely to be the ones who are into, I don't know, like stylish.
Yeah.
They're more likely going to be the good dancers, right? I remember a very controversial political figure and the arguments that people had about their type. And one of the types that was on the table was ESTP. And they're elderly as well, but they are not a particularly good dancer. And I remember somebody going, well, they can't be an ESTP because they're not a good dancer. I was like, well, I suspect that if they have extroverted sensing or sensation, it's probably the analytic version, right? They're a politician. So they might be one-sided that direction and be kind of a terrible dancer, actually. And the idea that an ESP type could be a terrible dancer is like, well, they've been more focused on, all the max aliveness stuff, not the sensate parts.
I think I have the same image of the person in your mind without naming them, and I'm pretty certain this person is one-sided. I would argue. I don't think anyone, even fans of this person, would have probably agreed that they're fairly one-sided.
Probably. So it's regardless of what this individual's personality type is, understanding analytic versus holistic alchemical reactions to the functions means that some of the stereotypes in our minds might not be accurate. Like all ESP types are good dancers. That might not be accurate. Most ESPs will be, because most of them will have access to both the analytic and the holistic.
Yeah.
But if they're one-sided, they won't, right? And so you might have an ESP type, again, that's a holistic user that would never in a million gajillion years ever say, get on a fast motorcycle and go do something, that feels really dangerous. They might never do that. And again, remember, it's harder for a holistic version to become an analytic version.
Yeah.
So they might go, well, I must not be an ESP type. I must be an ENP type because I prefer to sit around and talk with my friends than I do, jumping out of a helicopter onto a black diamond, and skiing all the way down or something. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily the only example. The willingness to do something, the desire to do something like that isn't the only symbol of an extroverted sensing user.
Yeah.
So if you enjoy sitting around talking with friends, that could still be that extroverted sensing or sensation. Yeah. And I suspect that there are quite a few, particularly ESFPs, but some ESTPs too, that are very interested in type, that are holistic users and believe they have ENP preferences. And my other suspicion is that holistic people who have a preference for holistic extroverted sensing or sensation as one of their first two functions are probably more into type than the analytic users. Yeah. That's my suspicion.
Yeah.
I don't know that to be true, but I suspect that.
Or there's more of them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And we probably train people out of being the analytic version because those are the ones who can't sit still in class.
Yeah.
Right? So we might have like a disproportionately high number of holistic users. So, because at least in this country, because we get trained out of it. So I think that that's a really good understanding of those two functions, or like an awareness that function can be split into those two styles. And I think the other part of it is all of us have extroverted sensing or sensation inside of us. Somewhere. And so if it's not one of our first two functions, do we have a preference for one or the other? And can the other side teach us something?
Yeah. Okay. Right. So that's sensation, extroverted sensing. Let's talk about the other attitude of sensing. That's sensing extroverted. Let's talk about sensing introverted. There's two flavors of introverted sensing, what we've nicknamed as memory for Personality Hacker. Now, memory or introverted sensing is all about the sensory impressions over time. It's about tracking those sensory impressions, noticing them. They're both inside of us as people. Like we have a sense of our past and what's come before. But we also can use external markers to track things, paperwork. There's metrics and standards and all these kinds of things that we use to keep track of the changes over time as well. And this is something that memory or introverted sensing people are often focused on, is those nuanced changes over time and noticing those and tracking them both inside the self and also in the world at large.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's it's a vast storehouse of sensory impressions, which is why those changes can be tracked, because there's a good memory for the detail of how it once was and the impression that gave a person. And then when it changes, it gives a different impression. So if you're focused in on those impressions, you're going to notice all those subtle changes. And I really like how Dario talks about introverted sensing or memory. I think it's a slightly different way than I've thought about it traditionally, but it's a desire to help people be civil, right? It's like, it's
interoperability of humans.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Its civilization is built on interoperability.
Yes.
Right. And standards.
Yeah.
Effectively. And so it's, we have a certain standard of tire size. Thank goodness. Right. And that helps us. It helps us be civil when we are refitting tires on our car, because think about how frustrating it would be if there was 4 billion different kinds of tires. And like, I can totally imagine that weirdly. I mean, maybe my intuition is just jumping and leaping, but it's like, that could end up in fistfights, right? The inability to find a tire for your car could get maddening.
I suppose it could.
Yeah. And so it's like
among a lot of other outcomes.
Right. Well, I mean, things are already frustrating, right? Yeah. So it's like, so just the ability to go get like, oh, this is the standard tire size for your car, and this is what you'll need. Yeah. And maybe it's so expensive you want to punch the person, but you don't, and you get your tires and it's fine.
Now that you've said it, this really is the threat of Western democracy. If I'm thinking about it, tire sizes and standards of tires. Like if we don't have that dialed in, we could lose it all.
Well, think about everything that is standardized, right? And I can think of so many different things. And I think I just walk through the world punching people out of frustration and anger. So tire size being the example used to indicate all the things that are being unmentioned.
Yeah, and when we don't have it, I mean, I think in terms of the early days of some of the digital video formats, I'm not even going back to the 80s with VHS versus beta. That's one of them. But I mean, in the past 15, 20 years, we've gotten better at the codecs and all the ways that we encode video. But for a while there in the mid 2000s, there were like all these options. And it was kind of like, well, which one do you want to choose? And it's, well, which one's going to be the one of the future? That's the one I want to choose. We didn't know. And so people would accommodate for that and have a lot of different things running and reverse engineer stuff. But now we're starting to get down to standardization around this. And it's actually helping things go better, because if I work with a videographer across the world, they send us a file, they're probably going to film it in the way we need it filmed so we can use it here. So it's actually a good thing that memory and introverted sensing does for us at that level. It helps us make things work across larger groups of people.
For sure. So the analytic version of this function, Dario calls it the defender.
Yeah.
And it's because it is fundamentally protecting civilization. Right. The things you're talking about, the standards, the interoperability, the capacity to have civilization, which it's a fragile thing, actually. Right. It needs defending. The ability. I mean, I don't want to date this podcast too much, but I guess it's not really dating the podcast, because we've been in the midst of all of this turmoil for years now. Right. And we are observing right now just how fragile civilization is, right? Yeah. How easy it can be taken, how much damage and destruction can happen in very small amounts of time that change the fabric of everything. And the defender, the analytic version of introverted sensing or memory, is designed to make sure that those don't happen too quick, that they happen at a pace where we can all keep up with it, so that we don't lose what has taken centuries to build, right? It's a fragile thing, and it needs people to protect it.
And when it's missing, people get confused and they're open for hijacking. I think during the pandemic was a good example of this. We lost a lot of our introverted sensing memory. No one was doing their normal routines. No one had their normal life at the time. You were even watching things on television. You're watching people that you'd normally see in a studio doing it from their homes. Wow, that's weird and different. I'm not used to this. This is nothing like I'm familiar with. And so it creates this soil for mass change to happen and people to be very confused and a lot of chaos to be injected into the system. So I think we've seen, in the vacuum of it going away for a short period of time, we've seen just how useful it is when it is there. I've come to appreciate it much more after going through the pandemic and watching what happened.
Absolutely. Yep. And Dario says it doesn't necessarily mean nice, traditional, or orderly. This analytic version isn't necessarily those things. they're not necessarily hysterical about safety. They know there are times when you need to court danger or go to war. So let's do that smartly and purposefully.
Yeah.
So it's not a resistance to all change. It's not a resistance to doing what needs to be done. It's a resistance to rushing into things, making changes too quickly, undermining the fabric of all of these, all of these institutions that we have. And that's what's distressing to the defender version of it, of introverted sensing. So one thing also I want to mention is that they do not the one thing I didn't want to mention, but I do want to, now that I'm thinking about it, is there does tend to be a traditional bent, right? They don't have to be traditional, but there does tend to be a traditional bent because traditions are part of keeping civilization going.
I would use the word consistency. Maybe even more than tradition. I mean, I think there's a desire to have consistency. And if the change can be made or the altercation can be made to keep some kind of consistent framework, the change is accepted. But the consistency is the most important. I think traditions help us keep consistency, but consistency is the metric.
Right. Well, and traditions are also the things we bake into ourselves,
Personal.
Our sense impressions. They become personal. Exactly. Yeah. So consistency, I do believe, is really important. I think the reason why they tend to be traditional, though, is because it personalizes it.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I'm speaking specifically to the interoperability of it all.
Right.
Not the personal sense of impressions that we take with us, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so to clarify all of that, it is the personal sense impressions that are the foundation of all of it.
Yes.
And traditions are very easy to bake into one's identity.
Correct.
And to the things that mean something to us.
Yes.
So there does tend to be a traditional component, but they don't necessarily have to be. It just tends to be that way because it's one of the easiest ways to be consistent and keep the interoperability of this institutions we've created that allow for that consistency.
Personal traditions, outer interoperability.
Yes. And that means being tapped into not just the personal traditions, but societal and cultural traditions.
Yeah.
That's where the interoperability comes from, right?
Yep.
And so it's baking in personally what is culturally common.
Yep.
Right. And there's a groundedness to that, right? He also mentions, and this is the one thing that I was going to say a long time ago. The one thing I want to mention about this specifically is that there is an association of introverted sensing or memory. A lot of people have an impression that it's about like sequencing or doing things in a certain order or, stabilizing and that sort of thing. And he mentions that sequencing and recalling factual details shows up more with the analytic version because sequencing is an analytic tendency. So it's not that the function itself is necessarily focused on sequencing. It's focused on sequencing when it's analytic because analytic is focused on sequencing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. And so then we tend to see it in that way when it's manifest. And I think the analytic versions of each of these functions are the more obvious because they're pushing out. They're louder. They're more in your face. They're more directed.
They're easier to define when you're writing Myers-Briggs type material for the internet or recording content for the internet or anywhere else, or you're writing a book.
Yep.
It makes more sense from an economic business model standpoint. You're writing a book trying to get a concept across, you're creating content for somebody in an article. You're going to probably favor the analytic version because it's easier to define and articulate to someone.
Yeah. Well, and they're just more obvious and easier to pick out.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's the version of it. That's a version of it. But it might not be the function that's being observed. It might be the analytic preference that's being. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Okay. So let's go to the holistic version of introverted sensing or memory. This one is, I think, this one I believe is the assumption is it's associated with feeling. And I think people think that the analytic version of sensing is associated with thinking. So that's another distinction I want to make here is that we get an impression of, say, ISTJs maybe as always being more of the analytic version. And I think the assumption is that it's introverted sensing when paired with extroverted thinking or effectiveness. That's what creates that analytic. And then the holistic, which we're about to go into, is more like introverted sensing or memory when paired with extroverted feeling or harmony. I think that's the bias that we have, or the blind spot in the type community, when really it doesn't matter what your judging preferences are. It doesn't matter whether you're a thinker or a feeler. You can have analytic introverted sensing or memory, even if you're an ISFJ. And you can have a holistic introverted sensing or memory, even if you're an ISTJ. So I think that's one of the big distinctions I got. I went, oh, that's a mistake I made. Yeah. I married the holistic version with feeling, but it's not. Yeah. All right. So all of that said.
Well, and I think just to your point, I mean, we've seen so many students come through our profiler training program. We're actually baking this into some of the core content now because it's very easy to mistype or misprofile somebody. If you're sitting down with a profiling session, if you don't have this at least in your head to watch out for, you go, oh, well, that must be this type over here. Whoa. It could still be a feeling type that's more analytic bent. It's not necessarily an ISTJ. Yep. Maybe it's an ISFJ. Yep. That you're just seeing more analytic come from. Yep. So that's something we've been working with our students on a lot lately to get really better at the methodology when we're live profiling somebody.
Yep, you got it. Okay, so all of that said, let's talk about the holistic introverted sensing or memory.
I feel like there's so many hyperlinks and footnotes on this podcast. We're like, caveat this, parenthetical this.
That might just be us too.
All right, fair enough. Right. Let's keep going.
All right, so Dario calls the holistic introverted sensing or memory function the hearth.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily anchored in any specific thing, unlike the analytic version, which is anchored in like civilization and maybe specific protocols or traditions, or like you mentioned, things that are interoperable. This is an anchoring to everything. He called it a table or a chair with 1,000 legs. It's very rooted. It's very grounded. It's very stabilized because it's the person's individual sense impressions that are baked into everything they've ever experienced. So if you take one away, they might not like that you took it away, but it's not going to change much for them because they have all these other sense impressions, all these other things that they're grounded to. It's like you can't ruffle them almost. You can't destabilize by taking any one thing away from them. So they tend to be a little bit more open to change, interestingly enough. Because if you rock the boat over here, it's like, I don't like that the boat is getting rocked, but I'm going to roll with it because it's not like you can destabilize me on all these other 999 things. So, okay, let's go ahead and change in that one way, right? And I'll figure it out. It's just this profound rootedness in the self and one's impressions. And so instead of being more of a defender and an anchor, it's more of like a warm rootedness. It's more like the hearth, right? It's like it's the center of it all. And at the center of it all is your entire life of impressions, right? But they're very personal to you. And that's one of the ways that it's not so assertive, because it's not trying to make this happen for everybody else. It's the self that's rooted in it.
And really it's weird because the person analytic might be more focused on interoperability outside of the self. But because of the analytic nature of introverted sensing or memory being focused on that, it probably has, let's just say it's got 5 ways to be interoperable. I'm oversimplifying, but let's just say it has 5 ways because it's focused on it. But the holistic introverted sensing or memory person, or this function, no matter where it falls in somebody's personality, this actually might be more interoperable because it's much more receptive and it'll play nice with almost anyone. So even though it's not focused as much on being interoperable, it's more focused on the self and the sensory impressions. How I see it is it probably has the tendency to be open more to more variances than the function if it was focused on interoperability, which is so weird. It's kind of like counterintuitive. It's like the photo negative of itself almost. So I thought that was very interesting as I was looking through this material.
Yeah. And it's the holistic users that are more likely to be tuned into all those subtle changes like we talked about, because Dario says their database is so big and things are not just pushed into a box.
Yeah.
So they're the ones who are more likely to be very detail oriented about everything. He said, asking, is it black or white, is more of an analytic, introverted sensing or memory way of asking a question. To the holistic version, they see a palette of 64 million colors. right? It's all, there's so many different, all of this variance, because again, it's like what they're rooted in is a huge variety of things, right? It's a table with 1,000 legs.
Diffused.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so everything evokes something a little different, right? And that means that all those subtle changes are going to evoke something a little different inside of them. My suspicion is it's a lot of holistic introverted sensing or memory users are the ones who do create really lovely environments for people. And I think that's probably why they're more tapped into that hearth quality.
Mm-hmm.
There's a desire for comfort. There's a little bit more of a desire for comfort with this style than the analytic. The analytic takes more hits for to ensure that they're defending something. So they're willing to take more arrows to their comfort. The holistic version is more likely to create comfort and not allow you to take their comfort from them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
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 So there's like there's a subtle difference here. And it means that both are allow for some changes. One, because change is inevitable and they've got to defend the important parts within that change. And the other one is because even when you change, you can't take it. You can't take their comfort from them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's a flowing nature to this, as there is with all the holistic functions, right? There's kind of like a flow to all of this. And you see this with extroverted sensing or sensation. There's like a flow to life. It's like, I think Dario calls it an effortless flow, where you just sort of flow through the experiences of life. There's a flow of rolling with life, right? Like rolling with the punches, rolling with the changes, being willing to absorb them and kind of find your way in all of it, that the holistic version has, which is an attractive quality in that function. There's also a sense that he mentions that a hearth can be taken anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the groundedness inside the holistic version of this function, is that I mean, I always think of it in terms of, for myself, because I have it as an inferior fourth function, or my 3-year-old in my car model. I think of it as like the rhythms and routines of my life.
Well,
right?
A hearth can be taken anywhere. I think of scooping up the coals
Mm-hmm.
and taking them where you go, and like
Mm-hmm.
recreating the hearth, that feeling, that energy, that warmth, no
Mm-hmm.
matter where you are.
Exactly.
You root yourself back there and you restart a fire. I mean,
Right.
a metaphorical fire.
Exactly.
Wherever you go.
And I think of it as like routines and habits and rituals that can be taken with me no matter where I go. Right.
Yeah.
So I don't need this house, but I need some components that are familiar to me that I can take from this house to the next. And then I can reestablish that hearth. So that's part of the role with the punches, is the ability to kind of drop and then pick up the important rhythms, the important routines, the important elements that keep my life stable and going. That's more of that holistic version.
Whereas I think an analytic introverted sensing or memory is going to feel less of a bend and more of a break.
Mm-hmm.
Like when a change has to happen, it probably feels a little bit more cutting, a little more severe, a little more like, I got that taken from me, or that change was forced upon me.
Yes.
I didn't like that. I wish I was more in control of that change, or it
Mhm.
didn't happen at all, and pushing it away, a little more resistance.
Yep.
Than maybe the holistic side of it.
Right. Exactly. And each side has some, we'll go through all the functions. Each side has something to offer.
Yeah.
Right. And so if introverted sensing or memory is not one of your first two functions, again, just like with extroverted sensing or sensation, which side do you have a tendency to lean towards, and what lesson does the other side afford for you?
Yeah.
Like, I definitely have a holistic version of introverted sensing or memory, for sure. There are things that have happened to me that I should have been more of a defender around.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I should have been less roll with the punches. There's an advantage to rolling with the punches, but there's also an advantage to having boundaries and not letting people push you around, which the defender version is less likely to be pushed around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'm analytic in my memory, introverted sensing. So ENFP preferences, this is my 3-year-old or fourth function, inferior function. In my cognitive function stack, and I definitely have an analytic bent toward it. It is much more, when change happens and I'm not in control of it, or I haven't managed it, I get upset. I feel like something happened to me. I feel like somebody's doing something to me and hurting me or harming me, or
Right.
the universe is like, I get frustrated by that. So And that's not even my strength in my personality. But all of us have access to these two sensing functions somewhere inside of our own psyche. And so as you're listening along or you're watching, think and tune into your own life right now. What would you say extroverted sensing or sensation is for you, no matter where it is in your cognitive function stack and you decide your personality? We're talking about this outside of your personality for a moment here. It is the preferred function of all SPs in the Myers-Briggs system. But let's say you're not an SP, or you are, wherever this falls for you, what is it? Is it more of a holistic nature of that sensation or extroverted sensing, or do you have more of a holistic bent? And then if you tune into the memory or the introverted sensing process, what's coming up for you there? Do you think you lean more toward the holistic version of that or the analytic version of this? Mm-hmm. So as you're tuning in, what's coming up for you?
Yeah, I think there's an important thing that he mentions just before we completely close or complete the concept of introverted sensing or memory. This is a really important thing he mentions. He says, when we consider both sides of introverted sensing or memory, we see it as both an anchor and a home for people. That sounds wholesome. And children are impressionable, and a person's childhood is not necessarily wholesome.
Yeah.
So, nor are the impacts necessarily conscious.
Yeah.
So people hold all sorts of attitudes, attractions, and preferences based on impressions provided by family and society, pleasant or not, healthy or not, rational or not.
Yeah.
So we all have introverted sensing or memory, like you just mentioned. So our relationship with it needs to be healthy. It needs to be good because we have sense impressions that are in there that we're using all the time to make certain decisions. He uses the example of eating bad sushi one time. Like a difference between, just a quick difference between extroverted sensing and sensation and introverted sensing or memory is that a sensation person might have eaten bad sushi and that was just that experience at that restaurant, but then they go to the next one and they eat sushi and it was fine.
Yeah.
Whereas an introverted sensing or memory user might go, I'm never eating sushi again because it made me really sick.
Yeah.
And so the sense impression is like, I don't care where the sushi comes from. I'm not eating sushi again, right? Because it made me so sick and I hated it, right? We all have the introverted sensing or memory part of us that has had a sense impression that is influencing how we're going through life. So getting in touch with our version of it and recognizing whether or not it's gone into a defender stance or whether or not it's gone into a rollover stance, right? I mean, that's not that the hearth version is rollover. It's me. So I'm thinking about all the ways that I can improve it. But it's like my relationship to it is important. It doesn't matter what my personality type is.
What I guess the learning or the takeaway I have from that I would articulate is what I think you're saying is that the introverted sensing or memory process in us, no matter who we are, we have that part of us. It is not being judicious on what is being written on the hard drive of itself. Or in other words, like if it was a pristine hard drive, it'll take anything written on it. It's not like it's qualitatively going, well, that's not grandma baking cookie activity, so I'm not going to absorb that into the introverted sensing.
Right.
Like trauma, abuse, like bad stuff happening. Maybe somebody grew up in a war-torn country their entire life for 30 years. That's going to be written on the introverted sensing memory. It's not like it's like we talk about it as a quality of like grandma making cookies or, all the fun holiday traditions and it's wholesome and it's the Hallmark channel. And everybody that has introverted sensing wants to watch Hallmark movies, right? That's not at all what we're saying. We're saying that this process, this mental process is completely open to being written with any material on top of it. And so that can look like anything based on the person's experience they grew up with.
Yeah. And when we go through the personality life path program, which we do deep inner work using functions as a guide.
Yeah.
It is very common, particularly for NJ types.
Man, you're not kidding. I know exactly where you're going with this.
Yeah, but it's very important for people to have to really know whether or not they have a healthy relationship to their introverted sensing or memory. And a lot of times that's the work they need to do.
It's the most emotional week in the entire program that we have.
Yeah.
I would say even more than the two feeling functions. People have more emotional experience when we talk about that part of their life.
Yep. Yeah, because it is their life. It's the sense impression of their life.
Yeah. And
so it's important. It's important for us to know what our relationship is with it. And he also makes a little note. There is huge variance in people who have SJ preferences when being brain scanned.
Yeah.
Right. And so
it's the most variance of all the functions. It's the most uniquely wired.
Yep.
Right.
Yep, exactly. And so this is not a monolithic function.
Yeah.
Right. It's one that has a lot of texture. and it's very unique to the individual. And so, so knowing, like having a little bit more self-awareness around one's relationship to this function inside of themselves, I think is crucial.
So at risk of being too of the analytic person, I've been trying to lean back and be as holistic as possible and let time keep rolling. But
good job.
But the analytic clock in my head's going tick, tick, tick. We got to wrap this up.
Okay, let's wrap it up.
So what about you as you're tuning in and listening or watching along? We're talking about analytic versus holistic in general. We talked about those energies isolated. And then we talked about how we can apply those to our cognitive functions inside of our personality. We just chose the first two functions in the sensing, introverted sensing memory, extroverted sensing sensation, and we applied holistic and analytic frameworks or energy to each of those and some of the qualities we talked about. So as you look through you listen through the qualities, you think about the qualities that we articulated here. Where are you seeing that show up in your own life? Because we all have access to these two functions. It's just a matter of where they are in our personality. Doesn't matter what your type is. You have parts of yourself that are tuned into here. Do you think you lean with the function more analytic, more assertive, more focused, or do you lean more holistic, more receptive, more open and diffused? How do you see yourself in this experience? These two functions. Next week, we're going to talk about you want to talk about intuitive functions next, right? We'll talk about extroverted intuition and introverted intuition, but let's stay with the sensing for this week. What's coming up for you? Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story. We love stories because they're compressed experiences we can learn about your life through. And I think it's a great way to kick off a great conversation around this.
Yeah. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. You might be watching us on YouTube right now because we also have a video podcast. And if you enjoyed the episode, you can subscribe and hit the bell to let you know when future episodes are out. Yeah. And we highly recommend that you check out the Quest program, where we, as a group, as a tribe, we watch the episode, the podcast, the live podcast premiere that is currently happening on Sundays. And then we discuss the topic and do some journaling and understand how it can have power in our lives. And then we do an activity for the week.
Yeah.
It's intended to make type come alive.
Yeah.
And to use it in an active way. Not to just passively learn about type, but have it make changes in our life, help us understand who we are and how we can be, I like to say, become the most me, right? How can I be the most Antonia in a single lifetime? Yeah. And the Quest calls are intended to help you get closer and closer to becoming the most you. I don't like using the phrase the best version of ourselves because that's qualitative, right? It changes from context to context, but we can be authentic. We can be honest. We can be true to ourselves. We can hear our inner voice, that quiet, discreet inner voice. And the Quest is intended, that membership is intended to help you continually and perpetually be guided by the most you, that discreet inner voice. So come join us on Sundays with Quest.
Yeah, we're currently tuned in. I mean, it's not just with me and Antonia. There's an entire group online in a Zoom meeting format where we can actually do breakout rooms and you can talk with other people of like mind in small 3 to 4 person groups. So everybody gets a chance to share and articulate and express and learn and grow together. And then we come back to a main session where we're all together and we can share in a broader format. And myself and Antonia are there, and most of our team also shows up on a regular basis. We're going to grow this over time. I imagine we're going to look back many years from now and go, remember when we first started talking about Quest way back when we started it up?
Yeah.
I'm excited about it. We're in several weeks in at this point at the time of this recording, and I see it growing and being tied to things like coming to a city near you with live events, doing more live dynamic in the moment Zoom or live streams online. We're trying to bring this again from the abstraction of just kind of this thing we talk about out here to really applying it to the self. Also getting away from arguments and the debates around type. And if we're so focused on the explanation and the diagnostic all the time, well, we're really not applying it to the self. We're not getting into action to make our lives better and improve our relationships, our career, all the things that type can help us with. So Personality Quest is designed to cut through the BS, focus us back on the things that actually matter, which is the life we're living, not the abstractions we're talking about or debating, but the life we're living. So I'm excited about this because I think it's going to really open up people. If you want to learn more, go to personalityhacker.com/quest. I'd love to have you part of this program. I think it'd be really exciting to have you there. weekly. And if you join it, I will be very happy. So go do that.
Make Joel happy.
It'll be awesome. And it'd be cool to meet you live and in person on some of those experiences. So let's wrap this up. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you, hopefully on the Quest call right after this episode. We'll see you there if you're going to be joining us live there. But we'll also talk with you next week on the next Personality Hacker podcast. Hey, it's Joel from Personality Hacker. So a big reason people get into personality types is usually to improve their relationships with other people. And you can understand key differences between you and someone else when you understand how type works. So clearly, personality type is applied to relationships. But what about the relationship with yourself? Well, personality type can also help you navigate your career, or maybe an educational path that you need to follow, or other opportunities that present themselves, and it helps you know which are the right choice for you. And ultimately, personality is the key to unlocking identity-level worldview and life purpose. It all starts with getting the owner's manual for your personality type. In this owner's manual, we cover the basics of your personality. And then we dive a layer deeper to connect your personality to your relationships, your career, your worldview, and identity. Because we believe it's your life, and it should be designed for your personality. So start your owner's manual journey at personalityhacker.com. When you access your owner's manual, I recommend focusing on the ideal day exercise first, because when you start crafting your ideal day, you're being mindful about the type of lifestyle that you want. So designing a life around how you're naturally wired makes sense, and you can finally stop fighting yourself. So come discover and develop your unique personality at personalityhacker.com.